Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Rami Hayek, Senior Advisor at the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. On behalf of the Alliance for Green Commercial Banks, I'm very pleased to welcome you all to join today's webinar. This is a fireside chat with Mr. Bill Winters on banking's pathway to net zero and the role of the voluntary carbon markets. Today, we're delighted to have Ms. Kim-See Lim, the Regional Director of East Asia and the Pacific for the International Finance Corporation, who will moderate the session with Bill, Group Chief Executive of Standard Chartered PLC. Kim-See has worked as a global investment professional with 26 years of experience in emerging markets across Africa, Asia, Eastern Europe, and Latin America. Currently, she oversees the implementation of the IFC Region Strategy, Investment and Advisory business. Bill, our speaker today, who does not need much introduction, is a distinguished senior banker. Bill has been involved in the EU carbon market since its creation in 2005 and is now the chairman of the Task Force on Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets, which is sponsored by the Institute of International Finance. In this session, Bill will share his expert knowledge on the role of carbon markets and the global economy moves toward net zero and what banks are doing to facilitate this. He will also talk about how fighting climate change and the broader need for sustainable development are changing banking, as well as the role of banks in the net zero transition journey. May I now pass it to Kim-See. Kim-See, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rami. Good morning. My name is Kim-See Lim. As Rami said, I am the Regional Director for East Asia and Pacific at the IFC, the private sector investment arm of the World Bank Group. I am delighted to moderate this fireside chat with Bill Winters on the topic of banking's pathway to net zero, hosted by IFC's Alliance for Green Commercial Banks in partnership with HKMA. Before we start, allow me to reflect on the World Bank Group and IFC's experience and objectives in green finance. The World Bank Group is committed to climate finance, and we recently announced an increase in our climate investments to 35% of long-term finance between 2021 and 2025. From July 2023 onwards, we will also align 85% of all our new direct investments with the objectives of the Paris Agreement, and growing that percentage to 100% of all new direct investments from July 2025 onwards. Investing at scale in climate solutions is a strategic priority for us. The World Bank Group is the largest multilateral provider of climate finance for developing countries. In the last 5 years, we have delivered over 83 billion in climate finance. At IFC, we have mainstream investing in climate energy, sustainable cities, climate smart agriculture, green buildings, and green finance. We also collaborate with governments, the private sector, financial institutions, and other development banks to increase climate-related investments. We can afford the cost of a transition to a low-carbon economy, but we need to invest urgently and at scale. Last November, we launched the Alliance for Green Commercial Banks to bring together financial and research institutions and innovative technology providers to accelerate the adoption of green banking practices and increase financing available to climate investments. Through the Alliance, we aim to work closely with institutions like Standard Chartered, which have demonstrated their commitment to climate finance. As Rami mentioned earlier, Bill is certainly passionate about protecting our climate and is a man on a mission when it comes to ensuring Standard Chartered leads the way. As one of the world's largest financial institutions, Standard Chartered's commitments to achieving net zero in its operations by 2030 and in its financing by 2050 are set to make a dent in global greenhouse gas emissions. Now let's hear from Bill himself. Our audience will have an opportunity to ask questions towards the end of our session. Bill, thanks so much for your time today. Let's dive in. Can you tell us how you think fighting climate change and the broader need for sustainable development is changing the banking sector?
First of all, thank you very much for having me, and Kim-See, thanks for your introductory comments. It really is, it's great to see what the IFC and the World Bank Group are doing to promote climate change, because it's very clear to us that the only way that we can crack this problem, and it's a big problem, is if we attack it in the areas where we can all have the highest impact. And what we've seen very clearly, I think what is very clear, is that the greatest impact is to help the less developed economies in the world to transition themselves. We also know that that's where the financing gap is the greatest. So the work that the IFC is doing and the World Bank is doing, as well as other multilaterals, to make sure that that financing gets to where we can have the greatest possible impact is absolutely key. And obviously at Standard Chartered, a big part of our focus is finding a way to channel that funding into the projects that can make the most impact using all the tools at our disposal. To your specific question, I think climate change is absolutely changing the nature of banking. I mean, first and foremost, there's the risk. If we don't manage to address the climate change, the level of emissions that's driving temperature change to 1.5 degrees and beyond, if we don't address that risk, we know what the consequences are. For Standard Chartered Bank operating across Asia, Middle East, and Africa, we'll have about 20 of our key markets that are very severely affected, either by flooding or by unbearable heat, droughts, changing weather patterns, et cetera. So from a business perspective, this is already an untenable risk if we don't address this. We know as well, though, that a big part of our mission as a bank is to help our clients to adjust to the realities of the world, seize opportunities, but also manage their own risks. And we've done some interesting research at Standard Chartered that pointed out the amount of financing that will be required for the world to affect its transition to a net zero economy, but also for less developed countries to affect that transition. And we know the numbers. It's something like $3.5 trillion per annum needed to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, the bulk of which is climate related. And we know in particular that the financing that's available to address that $3.5 trillion problem in the developed markets is probably somewhere between 70 and 80% accessible through identified channels. In the emerging markets, in the less developed countries, it's under 20%, and in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, it's less than 10% of the necessary financing is available. So for Standard Chartered, given these are many of our home markets, the objective is to pull all the levers that we can to get the financing from the various sources available into the hands of people that can use it most. And I know that means working very closely with you, Kim-See, and the IFC and the World Bank Group, because the components of blended financing are critical and will only become more important through time.
Thank you, Bill. Absolutely, we'll be delighted to partner and do more with Standard Chartered. Moving on to net zero, Bill. So what in your view is the role of banks in the transition to net zero?
It's a really fascinating question. And I think if you asked most people 3 years ago, what does net zero mean? I think most people, probably in business, maybe even in the world, would say, no idea. I mean, it sounds like it may be a refrigerator or freezer unit in my kitchen. But obviously, it means something very different. And the focus around corporations and governments making commitments to net zero is accelerating at a very rapid pace. So I guess there's something like 3,000 listed companies now that have made commitments to net zero. I've not spoken to all 3,000. I've spoken to many of them. I'm pretty sure that most of them don't know what it means for their business and what it means for the actions that they need to take and what is going to come out of the back end. But they know that it's something that they have to do because they've heard from their stakeholders that this is critical. Now, who are their stakeholders? Well, number one is shareholders. Shareholders have been very clear that they expect responsibility from the companies they own. Number two is their own employees. Right? I mean, I know in my bank, if we sit up and said, guys, we're going to try to skirt around this net zero issue. We're going to drag our feet. There's a large proportion of my colleagues simply would not accept that. They'd either revolt or they would quit. And so that's the second stakeholder. Third stakeholders are our clients. And our clients, I think, have a bit of a mixed view. On the one hand, they know that they have obligations themselves. And on the other hand, they know that they need help in getting there, so just achieving this financing. And then there's, of course, civil society. And civil society, whether it's NGOs or various community groups focused on the environment, will call out the people who they think are falling short of their net zero commitment. So we know that the pressure is there, and the pressure to articulate a transition is there. Inevitably, when people are trying to put pressure on elements of the business society, it's easiest to go through the banks, because if you can find a way to choke off the money, to reduce the money that's available to people who are doing the wrong thing, and maybe make more money available to the people who are doing the right things, that seems to have an impact. In this case, and that's certainly happening here, right? We as a bank, I mean, we were one of the founding members of the Net Zero Banking Alliance. My colleague is the chairman of the Net Zero Banking Alliance. And this is a group of banks. It will expand, and as part of the broader global financial services banking or Net Zero Alliance, we know that banks together are trying to figure out what exactly does it mean to get to zero emissions off of our financing activities, because there's no rule book. The regulators haven't said this is what you have to do. The shareholders who have said we expect you to get to net zero have said, well, you decide what you're going to do, and then we'll tell you whether we think it's okay. It's okay, that's fine. Putting the burden on us to do this. So we're developing our plans. At Standard Chartered, we're working very hard to come up with our net zero transition plan. We've committed to publish this in the fall of this year, so in just a couple of months. We'll put it out for consultation. People will have different views. We know that there's a group of people that will say, this whole transition thing, it doesn't make any sense. We want you to go to zero tomorrow. Do not finance anybody that deals in fossil fuels. Okay, that's not practical. That would destroy the global economy. It's not going to happen. It's not the right thing to do. Rather, we have to transition. There's another group of people that will say, you're putting too much burden on the economy. Forcing the pace of transition to meet a 2050 target is just going to cause too much economic harm, right? So we know that we'll have those two extremes. And then there will be lots of discussion over the methodology that we put forward. Why are we putting, I don't know if we'll be the first bank, but why are we putting this statement out, this detailed plan? Because we think it's incredibly important to articulate a framework, and then other people can criticize it. We can make it better, it will evolve. We then want to take that, and we will take that framework and put it to our shareholders and say, is this acceptable to you? They'll vote on this at our annual general meeting in May of next year. And hopefully then we can really get going. And I would hope that this would be part of the process of the broader financial community coming together to articulate all of our transition plans. Just the final comment that I would make is, to me, what's really interesting is at this time, it's not just the banks. It's also every multinational corporation that I've come across has made their own net zero commitments. When I talk to those multinational corporations about how they're going to address their net zero transition, they say, look, on average, 25% of our emissions are coming from things that we control directly. 75% is coming from our suppliers. So what we're doing, in the same way that the banks are and will be putting pressure on our clients to deal with their own net zero transitions, multinational corporations are pressuring their suppliers. So research that Standard Chartered did, 85% of multinational corporations are intending to directly interact with their suppliers to address their net zero commitments. 75% of their emissions are coming from their suppliers. 15% of those multinational corporations are already discriminating against suppliers that don't have credible net zero transition plans themselves. And the remainder say that they will within the next 2 years. So all of Standard Chartered's clients and other corporations that are operating in Africa, Middle East, Brazil, US, anywhere in the world, are going to be under pressure from their financiers to effect a proper net zero transition. Of course, with the pressure from us also comes a willingness to help. We'll provide $75 billion or so in the next few years of financing to help our clients to transition to net zero. But they're also going to be getting the pressure from the buyers of their product. And if they don't find a way to accommodate those buyers, they're going to find that their market share, their income, their profits will fall. Eventually, they will fail. So I think the pressure is coming from all sides. And when I think about where this leaves us, I think there will be very few places for a polluter to hide going forward. And that, of course, is the objective.
Thank you, Bill. Fascinating to hear your insights to this important topic. I want to switch the discussion a little bit to Asia, which is where we are today, and welcome to Hong Kong, Bill. What are the risks of inaction, particularly in the Asia region?
Well, I think the risks of inaction are the risks that we'll see everywhere in the world. I mean, we've seen these very dramatic climate changes already. And while there may still be some speculation whether the current wave of climate events that we're seeing is related to climate change, I don't think there's any real doubt that eventually what we're seeing today will be worse if we don't address this climate challenge. And that we see it in the form of flooding, we see it in the form of drought, we see it in the form of unbearable heat in some cases. We know that means displaced people. We know that means reduced economic activity, and we know that in extremis that leads to conflict, where people are fighting over what could become a more and more scarce set of resources. So the risk is very real. It's as real in Asia as it is in any other part of the world. The opportunity is also great because many of the Asian economies are marketplaces where the relative carbon intensity of the underlying economic activity is quite high. So it's very encouraging, of course, to see China tackle this problem head on with a net zero commitment by 2060, which of course is 10 years later than what the science says is critical to avoid the 1.5 degree climate change. But I imagine that with the private sector in China, under the kind of pressure that I think every company in the world will face, I'm still hopeful that China can make very material progress by 2050, maybe even get all the way there. Yeah, we'll see. But the impact of reducing carbon emissions in markets where the carbon intensity is quite high is obviously greater. I mean, another little bit of research that we did at Standard Chartered, the impact of us financing or helping build a renewable power project in South Asia is about 7 times the impact of building the same facility in Europe. Why? Because Europe is already quite advanced in terms of relatively clean power sources, and parts of South Asia are not. So the most important thing for us to do is to get the money that's available into the hands of the people that can make the most impact in terms of reducing carbon emissions. And quite a bit of that is in Asia.
Thanks, Bill. I think you also touched on the opportunities, which is very interesting to hear about. I mean, for sure, East Asia accounts for 30% of global GDP, but a disproportionate amount of GHG emissions in marine plastics. So very, very glad to hear that there are opportunities indeed to scale climate investments in this region and make a difference. Thinking ahead of the COP26, Bill, do you see a need to get more from policymakers to ensure a smooth transition to net zero?
You know, of course, the answer is yes. And in an ideal world, there would be a global agreement on greenhouse gas emission reductions that would be supported by enforcement mechanisms that could be applied uniformly. People that opt out or choose not to participate would be subject to carbon border adjustment tariffs. I mean, I don't know exactly the policy prescription, but in an ideal world, that's where we would be. In fact, in an ideal world, we would have been there 25 years ago when the science was already pretty clear. But we know this is COP26, so we can count how many COP sessions there have been. And while there's been progress, whether it was in Kyoto or Paris or the sessions in between, there's been progress, but we have not nailed this problem. Governments have not nailed this problem. I'm going to go into COP26 this year optimistic that we'll have some breakthroughs, but I think we must prepare for the eventuality that either there isn't agreement on some of the key aspects of global cooperation, or there's agreement, but the enforcement mechanism is weak enough that it's not highly reliable. And I think that's where the private sector comes in to complement public sector activities. I think this is one of it's an imperative. I think it's an obligation. And I know as a CEO of a public company, with many clients who are also public companies, that the pressure on us to complement what's going on in the public sector from policymakers, that the pressure is enormous. I mean, in the whole idea that you need to have a belt and braces, governments should do what they're going to do, but the private sector should also do what it can do. If there's some overlap, that's fine, because as we're seeing, and we saw it as recently as the UN report yesterday, the problem is acute, and it's not only is it not going away, it could be getting worse. So I imagine Kim-See we'll talk about the carbon markets at a point, but I think one important private sector initiative to complement the outright reduction activities that every corporation, public and private, I think that every corporation is feeling, is to reduce in every way possible, trying to get that into the realm of what's economically viable. But the existence of a carbon market and the ramping up of a carbon market could be materially helpful in terms of complementing the outright reduction activities and creating both a transparent and visible markets that tells us, hey, this is the price of carbon, the real price of carbon, but also allows the money to get into the hands of the people that can actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Let's switch to the carbon markets, as you said right now, because I think it's a really interesting topic. As the chairman of the task force on scaling voluntary carbon markets, can you share a little bit more about the objective of that task force and what are its goals?
Yeah, carbon market's been around for quite a while. Voluntary market's been around for over 20 years. Key markets like the European emission trading system have been around for a little bit less, but are quite robust. But unfortunately, the compliance markets, like the European market or now the Chinese market, the government regulated markets, often associated with some sort of cap and trade or quota-based system. They cover a relatively small proportion of global emissions, just as a matter of fact. Perhaps that will expand over time. But it's not going to solve the problem. Those markets will not solve the problem in and of itself. The idea with the voluntary carbon market has always been to operate outside of the strict policy circles and to allow credible, legitimate projects that can reduce greenhouse gas emissions or reduce carbon from the environment to obtain funding. Funding in the form of payment for carbon credits, but also facilitating financing. Unfortunately, for much of the last 20 or 25 years, the voluntary carbon market has been largely ungoverned. So there were standard setters, there were people that were verifying contracts, but they had somewhere between reasonably different and very different approaches. And the consequence of that was that a number of projects got through that were probably never very effective in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, or were effective at a point in time, but then became ineffective later, or where there was, for example, a reforestation project or a project to avoid deforestation, so to keep people from cutting down forests, where the verification was inadequate or it was adequate for a while and then petered out. So the consequence of that was that while 2 years ago, there was $300 million of voluntary carbon credits traded. Last year, there was about $1 billion of credits traded. This is very small, but also the market's not very credible. So there was low confidence that when buying a credit, that it would actually be recognized by these various stakeholders that we talked about earlier. Low confidence that that the corporation buying the credits or the individual buying the credits would actually get credit themselves for having done the right thing, or would feel themselves that they've used their money in a good way. So the mission for the task force on scaling voluntary carbon markets was, number one, to set a minimum level of standards that could be agreed on by the entire community. Now, the task force is made up of 250 organizations representing polluters, so buyers of carbon credits, people who are originating carbon credits, so people who are either taking carbon out of the environment or avoiding carbon going into the environment, exchanges, intermediaries, banks, the big investor alliances who are the key stakeholder group for many public companies in terms of driving net zero behavior, as well as individual investors, a good healthy dose of real experts coming from academia, and some policymakers who are not trying to drive this from a policy perspective, but are participating in the process. So 250 entities, over 400 members, spent the better part of a year setting, number one, what are the minimum standards? And then thinking through how we support those standards, how we assess at the outset, how we verify, et cetera. Number two, how do we put a governance structure in place so that those standards can be maintained over time, so effectively curated. The technology will change, perceptions will change, expectations will change. We need a governing body that effectively is the regulator of this market. And then number three, to put an infrastructure in place so that these contracts can be traded in a way that maximizes visibility, that gives us the greatest opportunity for scale. The bet that we're making is, what's a good outcome? Well, a good outcome is that there's a big, liquid, robust, transparent, and most importantly, credible market that all the stakeholders will look at and say, yeah, once a corporation has reduced their emissions to the greatest possible extent, you've got some emissions that you just can't eliminate. And you can use carbon credits, buy some credits to offset those emissions in order to get to net zero. That money is going to go into the hands of people that can actually get the carbon out of the environment. Right? That's a good outcome. A second good outcome that doesn't get quite as much attention is if there's a single price for carbon that we know that it costs, pick a number, $40 a ton. And that price makes its way into corporate decision-making, in individual decision-making. That's an extremely impactful contribution to the equation. So I know that if I'm a manufacturing company and I'm looking at my net profit, and my net profit is 100, but I know that at $40 a ton, the cost of carbon that I'm putting into the community is 120. I've actually reduced value for society, not created value for society. And I think having a number, a price, which is credible and observable, will really influence corporate and individual decision-making in a way that otherwise is a bit abstract.
Thanks, Bill. I wanted to so-called go a level deeper on the carbon markets, because it's really interesting topic for today's discussion, I think. What would be the key enablers that are critical for us to scale this voluntary carbon markets? So you talked about the governance in place and the incentives and so on, but what would really, help us scale this market? Thanks.
I think there's a few preconditions. I think number one, we have to improve the quality of the data that we all have around what are we emitting today, and that's got to be. This is happening through TCFD, so the Task Force for Disclosure for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, right? So this, we're getting to the point where the necessary data is available, so that buyers of product and financiers of product can understand what the actual emissions are. That's the starting point. Second is corporations and governments making transparent net zero commitments that are based off that data. So credible commitments with very specific plans relating back to that data that can come from TCFD. So perhaps the TCFD type data needs to be mandated and regulated. I think it will be, society will force that, but governments could probably accelerate that. Perhaps the net zero commitments need to be regulated or mandated. Again, I think society will get there. Governments may have a role in facilitating that. Once the net zero plans are in place, there's got to be a taxonomy that's agreed. And there are various discussions. Europe is probably leading the way on establishing a taxonomy. But the number one focus has to be for corporations to reduce where they can reduce. Right? The carbon credit market is only useful after we've reduced as much as we can in each individual company through time. So there's got to be constant and persistent focus on reductions. And this is where a price for carbon is quite helpful, because corporations can say, look, it's actually worth it for me to invest in carbon reducing technology for my business because it's cheaper for me to reduce than it is to go out and buy carbon credits, right? To look at this price that's observable. So reduction has to be the primary focus. For those hard to abate emissions or difficult to reduce, then we can use carbon credits. So necessary conditions, all of those are sort of necessary conditions leading up to the use of carbon credits. For the market itself, we have to have I think as close as we can to a single set of global standards, number one, that are accepted and that generate high confidence from the various stakeholders who are setting putting this pressure on all of us to comply. We need to have a governing body that makes sure that we maintain those high standards. And then we obviously have to have an infrastructure to support that. And the infrastructure can be standardized exchange-traded contracts, or a relatively transparent marketplace for over-the-counter or customized transactions. And part of what we've sort of built into the framework for the voluntary carbon market through the task force I've been chairing has been the whole idea that sometimes when people engage in a climate reducing project, it's also important for them that there are other co-benefits. There are other things that are happening alongside the reduction of carbon. Those things might include protecting biodiversity or promoting biodiversity, protecting water supplies, creating local employment, doing no harm to local communities. So what we'd like to do is to establish a framework, not just for the absolute reduction of carbon, but also a framework that they can measure the other co-benefits that, or costs, but the co-benefits that come along with these particular projects. So that if somebody wants to effectively pay more to get additional co-benefits also in a confident and transparent way, they can do that. And I think this is a lot to pull together in the very short time that we have, actually, to save the planet. Let's be honest, right? I mean, and if we needed a reminder, we got it with the UN reports yesterday. We can expect much more of that leading into COP26. But we don't have a lot of time to waste. So we've got to get on this right away. There are a lot of conditions, but let's start where we can start, and let's fill in the pieces and become better and better as we go along.
Thanks, Bill. I would like to switch gears to Standard Chartered. Can you tell us what Standard Chartered is doing in the carbon market space?
Yeah, so obviously through my role in the task force, I've had several colleagues working with me. We're very keen to promote this voluntary carbon market, and I think there's various roles for a bank to play. There are existing traded markets today, so the European emission trading system, for example, isn't the credits coming off of that compliance scheme are actively traded. There are and will be other compliance markets where there's a role for a bank just to promote the activity, to provide liquidity, to help find buyers, promoting the activity with buyers and sellers. So that's one area. Second is we participated in one particular venture already that we've announced, which is called Climate Impact X, where the objective is, and this is an Asian-based initiative, although contributing to the global market, anchored to the Task Force for Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets core carbon principles. So consistently meeting that very high standard. And we want to initially create a marketplace where buyers, so originators of projects, people that would have a deforestation or an avoided deforestation project in Indonesia, or a renewable project in Cambodia, that is genuinely additional in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The promoters of these projects can come to this marketplace and say, who would like to buy the carbon credits coming off this project? And the various corporations anywhere in the world, Asia or elsewhere, or investors would be the other side of that credit transaction saying, hey, I'd like to buy that credit. I'm going to transfer $40 a ton to the project owner through the marketplace. And that's what's going to help with the financing. And perhaps the IFC will finance that in part because it's a good project, in part because it's getting the benefit of this $40 a ton subsidy coming through carbon credits. And perhaps the fact that this transaction, which will have our exchange, Climate Impact X, will help to assess the quality of the project at the outset, will also help to verify through time using satellite imagery or drone technology or for reforestation projects, the various verification mechanisms that we can put in place, and maybe the IFC or Standard Chartered as a lender, maybe we're going to do this one together, as we do many things together, we'll say, hey, I actually take a lot of comfort from the fact that the verification standards on this project are coming from an independent organization that's doing so in the context of carbon credits. So one, I like the fact that they're getting extra funding from the carbon credit market. Two, I like the fact that it's being verified and recognized. So I'm going to provide the financing to that project. Of course, there's a role for a bank and there's a role for multilateral lenders in that regard. So those are just a few of the ways that banks can contribute to the carbon market. More broadly, for us, our markets, Standard Chartered's markets, are the markets that will be amongst the worst affected by climate change. So we have a real vested interest in seeing if we can prevent this. We also, our client base is the client base that will find it most difficult to obtain the financing that they need to affect their own transitions to net zero. Our job as a sustainable financier is to arrange and develop that financing from our own balance sheet, working with partners, whether it's the IFC or other multilaterals or development banks or export credit agencies or the like. This is a big business for us. And while we're always focused on doing the right thing, we think our sustainable finance business will be a meaningful contributor to our income and to our profits through time, especially if we can marry all the tools at the disposal of any bank. So the full range of access of capital for sustainable financing from public markets, private markets, and multilateral or government-backed markets, as well as the full range of carbon market sorts of opportunities that can help leverage these projects. So we see this as really as an all-encompassing thing, where we've got the risks that we have to manage. We've got the need from our clients that we always try to accommodate. We've got the enforcement role, which is to talk to our clients and say, we've got we have a net zero transition plan. Yeah, dear client, we need you to come along with us on this ride to net zero, because if you don't get to net zero, we don't get to net zero. In our experience so far, so for example, we said 4 years ago, we're not going to finance any more coal-fired power plants. And we haven't. No more coal-fired power plants, no more coal producers. Initially, many of our clients said, hey, I'm a utility. I'm in a fast-growing country. If we can't have coal-fired power, we're not going to be able to provide the power to our kids. They won't be able to go to school. They won't be able to use computers. So, okay, let us work with you on the ways that we can get the financing in place so that you can get alternative sources of power that are clean. And while the initial reaction was negative, no surprise, and they say, who are you, Standard Chartered Bank, to tell us in my country how we should be running things? In every single case, we got to the point where we got the power facilities built. We got it built with clean power, often cheaper as well, right? So that's and of course, we did the right thing. We managed our risk. We honored our commitments. And we also helped to do what we do, which is make loans and to arrange financings. So that story will repeat itself over and over and over again as these net zero transition plans become codified. There will be some clients, and we have had some. We've unfortunately had to exit several coal producing clients who said, like what you're doing. Actually, they didn't say that. They said, I don't like what you're doing. We're not going to comply. We can't comply. We choose not to. We'll get our financing elsewhere. Goodbye. Okay, goodbye. We're very sorry to see you go because we think we could help. But if that's the way it's going to be, that's the way it's going to be. And for a while, those companies will be able to get financing elsewhere. The bet I'll make is that bit by bit, if you don't have a credible net zero plan, it will be very difficult to get financing anywhere.
Thanks so much, Bill. Let's now go to the floor, to the audience, and let's open it up for Q&A. So for the members in the audience, please use the raise your hand function if you would like to ask a question to Bill. Alternatively, you can just post your question in the chat box. I see here we have a question from Grace Hui. Grace, could you please introduce yourself and ask your question?
Thank you, Kim-See. Hi, Bill. I am the head of Green and Sustainable Finance at HKEX. As you may know, HKEX and SFC are leading a feasibility study looking at Hong Kong being the regional carbon trading center. And as such, we're looking at both, the cap and trade market as well as the voluntary carbon market. And I can definitely vouch the great work that your task force has done in the last few months. And we are very happy with the recommendations, especially the governing body that will be set up. Looking at Hong Kong's role and our being the green finance center for the Greater Bay Area, how can we utilize TSVCM and the standards to grow a high integrity voluntary carbon market in China? Given that China is already going to be the largest cap and trade market, but how do we help China to become the largest voluntary carbon market as well, given the nature-based solutions that they have and many other renewable and carbon sink projects that they have? Thank you.
Well, very nice to see you, Grace, and thanks for the question, and thanks for the fantastic work that you're doing, because I think where do I come out? Very specifically, I think Hong Kong can and should be the center for the voluntary carbon market trading for the region, certainly China and Greater China, and why not beyond? Now the question is, will there be a meaningful market, a meaningful voluntary carbon market in and around China? And the argument against goes, well, look, China's just launched a national carbon exchange. It's going to cover 50% of the emissions of the country. And so there really isn't a need for a voluntary carbon market to complement that. The government's going to put the arrangements in place to make sure that the emission reductions necessary will happen. That's actually not accurate, in my opinion. The correct story is both the other 50% of the emissions coming from various companies or segments of the economy which are probably less carbon intense, but nevertheless, it's 50% of the emissions of the largest emitting country in the world, will be under and are under already tremendous pressure to articulate their own transition plans to net zero. China is also the biggest exporter in the world. The people who are buying China's products, whether it's in Korea, Japan, the United States, Europe, will themselves be insisting that China as a supplier and as an exporter meets the climate commitments that are consistent with their own climate commitments. So Chinese corporations are going to feel the same pressure that every other company in the world faces. And therefore, they will do all that they can to reduce, I'm sure, in China. There will be some hard to abate sectors, and they will access the voluntary carbon market, just like participants elsewhere in the world. Now, where should those voluntary carbon credits trade? Hong Kong has a fabulous underlying infrastructure and history as a financial center that has been critical for helping China access capital from the rest of the world, helping the rest of the world access markets in China, doing so with a wonderful infrastructure, with a legal framework, with HKEX as an outstanding and absolutely leading global exchange. I mean, so Hong Kong has tremendous advantages as a financial center that can serve this market. And you might have China as an anchor for these activities, but the market, if we're all successful, will be global. And credits will be fungible globally. And the same way that you see international investors accessing the Hong Kong market to access Chinese and other shares, you'll find international buyers of credits and suppliers of credits coming into the Chinese market or the Hong Kong market if we're successful in setting it up the right way. Now, of course, to be successful, you've got to maintain an absolutely level, consistent, and predictable set of standards that have to be very high integrity. That's what the Task Force for Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets is all about. It's creating that confidence that the credits that you spend your money on are good value, that they're doing the right thing. And the governing body, which is it's an independent board of directors with participation from the market, participation from world-class experts, but majority independent, i.e. not active in buying or selling credits themselves, but with a level of expertise. Their job, people often say, well, who's this board of directors going to work for, right? And who are they accountable to? The simple answer is they're accountable to the planet, right? We've created a community here. The objective is to protect the planet. And this board of directors is acting as a custodian for the principles that will allow this important traded market to make its contribution to the protection of the planet. So I'm delighted that HKEX is focused on this. I know you've worked closely with the HKMA and the SFC. I think you're onto the right thing. Of course, from a Standard Chartered perspective, you'll get all the support that we can possibly give you. And in terms of the task force, this is exactly what we hoped would happen following the task force. We're just very quickly on the task force. We issued our final report on July 8th. We actually closed the books last night on the applications to become members of the board of directors, as well as other key governance roles. That selection process should be completed in the next 6 weeks or so. So we hope to have this thing up and running, maybe even in a position to allow some trades to go through based on the core carbon principles by the time of COP26.
Thanks, Bill. I also see that there's a question from Ben McCuhay. Ben, please introduce yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. My name is Ben McQuay. I'm a founder of a ESG-focused law firm based here in Hong Kong called Ben McQuay & Co. I'm also one of the co-founders of the Hong Kong Green Finance Association. Bill, I'm sure I can speak for everyone in thanking you and Standard Chartered in your leadership in trying to tackle the many challenges of making sense of the voluntary carbon market. You may also be interested to know that actually we just announced this morning the first offshore demo trade of high integrity CCERs right here in Hong Kong, which we're very happy and proud and excited about. So my question relates to quality control. So how can banks drive the voluntary market towards high integrity only carbon credits? Thank you.
First of all, congratulations on getting a high integrity CCR trade done. That's fantastic, and this market will, I think, will develop in many different ways. But finding the links between the compliance markets and voluntary markets, while not part of the mandate for the task force I chaired at all, be a wonderful set of developments if we could get convergence between these markets, or even maybe in trading terms, get some sort of a basis market or spread market between these different credits, so that people who are fundamentally just trying to do the right thing, meet the requirements of their stakeholders or whatever, can have confidence that the different markets are interacting in an understandable and a predictable way. I think to your specific question, what can banks do? I think we should all be subscribing to the core carbon principles coming out of the task force for scaling voluntary carbon markets. Banks this should be a premium brand. Now, there's nothing that we can do to prevent a carbon contract being traded that isn't compliant with the core carbon principles. In fact, there's lots of them out there today. I think you Ben, I'm sure know, but maybe some of the listeners don't. I mean, if you ask somebody today, what's the price of carbon? If you go to the California exchange, it's about $1. If you look at, there's 4 or 5 listed futures contracts in Chicago that trade between $4 and $5 a ton. I'm not sure what price you traded your CCRs at today, but I think the national market price in China is around $9, something like that. The European emission trading system price is around $55. All right, so you've got a price ranging. This is just carbon, right? Carbon is carbon. When it goes into the environment, it all has exactly the same effect. But some contracts are trading at $1, some contracts are trading at $55. It's very confusing. Why is that? Well, the $1 contract, you can deliver just about anything, any contract that's ever been written, many of which are actually not contributing to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions at all. Whereas in the task force for scaling voluntary carbon market core carbon principles, I don't know what the price of those contracts will be. I guess it'll be closer to the European price than the California price, maybe a lot closer, maybe higher, I don't know. And to the extent that becomes the gold standard, and that's not a pun because there is an excellent verifier in the market called gold standard, but to the extent that becomes the benchmark, the reference point, where stakeholders say, if you have a lower quality credit than the core carbon contract or the core carbon principles, it probably doesn't count. And I think if banks support that notion that is what a high integrity credit is in the voluntary carbon market, then that will be one step closer to getting to that scaled, liquid, credible, and scalable market that we have as an objective.
Thanks, Bill. We also have a question from Ms. Elaine Ng. Elaine, over to you, please.
Thank you. And hi, Bill. Thank you very much for letting us in on the TSVCM work. I think that's crucially important. I also fully agree that China is an important stakeholder, and to be honest, they are crucial. They are an important source of nature-based solutions. They have a high concentration of polluters. And obviously, as you have mentioned, there's also going to be we foresee there's going to be strong demand from Chinese corporates to get to the national ambition that the president has set out. So my question is, in setting up the governance structure for TSVCM, I wonder if there is going to be any sort of inclusion of Chinese stakeholders in there, or broadly speaking, Asian stakeholders, because a lot of that benefits are going to come to Asia. So I think it's crucially important that they are part and parcel of governance, they're part and parcel of setting standards, so they don't see themselves as standard takers.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent point, and I completely agree. So we had several Asian and Chinese members of the task force. So amongst the 450 members, there were several from Asia and from China. The governing body, the deadline for submissions of applications, effectively for the board of directors and the expert panel, was last night, New York time. So I just saw this morning when I woke up some of the. There were many expressions of interest, so this is good. There's strong demand to become part of this body, and there was important demand from China and from Asia. So the selection process and the selection process will begin now that we've had these expressions of interest. I don't know what the final composition would look like, but having a body that represents or at least that can reflect the views of the key stakeholders, both in terms of the stakeholders in the planet, but also participants in the market, while maintaining the independence of the market, it will certainly be a consideration. And you couldn't be more correct. And that's part of why I'm here in Hong Kong this week and last week, is to make sure that we've got the right connection for this global effort through to China and Asia more broadly, because it's absolutely essential for solving this problem.
Thanks, Bill. I mean, clearly a very interesting topic and a conversation that can go on for much longer. We have unfortunately reached the end of our scheduled time, and we will need to wrap up this very interesting conversation. So Bill, thank you very much for sharing your insights and some of the climate-related innovations that are happening at Standard Chartered. I think this can be a source of learning for banks who are intending to take a similar path. We at IFC are also heavily investing in climate smart solutions for developing markets. And I think globally, we have identified some $29 trillion of investment opportunities in the green space in sectors like climate friendly agriculture, or climate smart agriculture, as we call them, clean energy, green buildings, and the list just goes on, right? And these are financing opportunities from now until 2030. So right. Lots ahead of us. So I hope that many of you watching today will be encouraged to learn more about IFC and HKMA and how our partnership through the Alliance for Green Commercial Banks to support the financial institutions in their journey to become green in Asia. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kim-See, and thanks for the outstanding leadership and partnership.
Thank you very much, Bill. All the best.
Thank you.